so I heard that you could get a pretty decent computer, personal computer, an IBM PC clone from a company that was called PCs Limited. And PCs Limited was actually a DBA for a company called Dell Computers. So I bought one of the first Dell computers, which was through PCs Limited, and carted it home. And I had this computer and this amber monitor, no color, just amber, that was it. And a stack of manuals, like this, huge stack of manuals, one for each computer program and one for the computer itself and one for the monitor and all this stuff that I had to read through and learn. And I started kind of banging away on the computer, and then it's like, okay, Marsha, now what I want to do next is I want to log in via long distance to this system that's out in California, and it's going to be about $10 an hour. And this led to a rather tense discussion. And of course, acknowledging who wears the pants in the family, that we squashed that idea.
Plutopia's Jon Lebkowsky was an early adopter of digital technology and the internet. On this episode of the Plutopia podcast, Jon presents a history of digital tech, life online in the 1990s, the internet, and much more.
I today want to talk a little bit about, I guess some of the history that I lived through, and I think you were both living through it too. And it started back in, right around 1990 or the early 90s is when the internet started to catch on, when the potential for mainstreaming to happen started to feel real. So the internet was created by ARPANET. It was, or as ARPANET, it was created by the government, and it was created to be a network that was resistant to disruption. Say if there was a nuclear attack or something like that.
Oops.
The network running, so it would be like hard to damage. But as it rolled out and as more people started using it, people were using it to send messages to each other. And that was really kind of the big deal. Almost everywhere you put the internet was that people started sharing information with each other or sending messages or, sending whatever they could. Early on, it was mostly just text-based stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So at the same time that you had the internet starting to roll out more, it was mostly research and development for a while. More and more corporations started coming on and connecting to it. And then other ways of access came around. For instance, bulletin board systems, which were not really connected directly to the internet, did have a way to share email over the internet. So you could send email from one bulletin board system to another. And this whole BBS thing started to kind of grow and evolve, and there were more and more of these bulletin board systems where people could log into them and post messages at each other, like post back and forth to each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we can thank our friend Tom Jennings for that one.
Right on. Tom Jennings with FidoNet built a huge and very popular network that was active in the late 80s, early 90s. And Tom did a lot of other things. There's a lot that we could talk about that Tom was involved with, but the main point of this is that the network connections were starting to form, more and more connections. And the way I came to this was that in the mid 1980s, so I was an avid devotee of the Whole Earth catalog and related publications. Whole Earth published several different versions, one of which, actually, I have it here. I was going to hold it up. Called Signal. And this Signal thing talks a lot about it's communication tools for the information age. So I was not a computer guy at the time Signal came out, except through maybe some stuff I was doing at work. And I was learning that I had an affinity for computers. Mm-hmm. And this thing called Signal appeared, and it was all chock full of stuff about, the potential power of computers and what they could do. And Coevolution Quarterly, which was published by Whole Earth, and the Whole Earth Software Review, and Signal, and all these publications that they were publishing at the time were all mentioning that they had a bulletin board system of their own. That Whole Earth had started a BBS as an experiment, and they called it the Whole Earth Electronic, without an E, just electronic link. And the abbreviation for that was the WELL. So you had this thing called the WELL, where people were hanging out together and basically messaging each other. It was what they actually call a conferencing system. And the way it was organized was that you had conferences, which were just kind of like big main forum areas.
Right.
And within those conferences, you had topics. And, topics could be about any subject that was related to the main subject, which was the forum. So if you have like a movies conference, then you may have topics for specific movies or specific kinds of movies, specific film styles, that sort of thing. So you have all these conversations kind of appearing on this bulletin board system. And the Whole Earth people had their own conference on the WELL, and they developed it by inviting, for instance, Deadheads, because they knew the Grateful Dead followers in the Bay Area were a huge community. This was all happening in the Bay Area. Scoop, you were there.
Oh, yeah.
And you were kind of in the middle of all this stuff. So in the Bay Area, you had Deadheads who were joining the WELL, and the WELL became a way for them to connect with each other. And that was one of the first really powerful community, online community bits that...
leave it to the Deadheads.
Yeah, went to the Deadheads. And then they started they were smart in that they said, well, what we really need to do is invite people who are great communicators. So they would give free accounts to journalists and writers and people like that.
Excellent. That's a great idea.
So a ton of people started showing up, and I was reading this stuff, and I was like this Whole Earth fanboy who was dying to figure out a way to meet all of these people and hang out with them. And suddenly I find out that all I really have to do is figure out a way to log into this bulletin board system that's in Sausalito, California. So some complications there. One thing is that in order to do that, I needed to have my own personal computer, which I did not have.
Pay for those calls.
That was a big deal back then. Yeah, and those calls
another thing was that long distance. So the WELL charged, I think it was $2 an hour for connection, but then you had to dial in. And my recollection is that long distance was something like $8 an hour. So it was like $10 an hour for me to log into the WELL.
Yeah, pretty much.
So I talked Marsha, my wife, into this idea that we would get a computer. She wasn't sure that we should go the expense because we were going to have to go to the bank and get a bank loan to buy the computer.
Yes.
They were not back then.
No.
I think it was like $3,500 or something,
But
4,000,
oh,
and that was a lot,
yeah.
And she was reluctant, but she was also a realtor. And I pointed out to her that she could also log into her multiple listing service and that she could do her MLS stuff from home. She had to go to the office to do that all the time. And she liked that idea.
Yeah.
And it gave us a business reason to have the computer, which made it a write-off, of course.
That's very smart. I did the same thing to get my first expensive computer because my wife was an accountant. And so I showed her calc and various other things like Lotus 1, 2, 3 eventually. It's like, well, buy that thing, boy. So it's like,
wow,
free on that one.
Yeah. So, and Lotus 1, 2, 3 comes into this at some point too. But because I ended up, through all of the stuff that happened after that, I ended up meeting Mitch Kapoor, who was the guy who, Lotus 1, 2, 3 was his company, but that's farther down the road. I had just a 300 baud modem, which is what most people had then, because that was kind of it at the time. That was about as fast as you could get. And I went out, so I heard that you could get a pretty decent computer, personal computer, an IBM PC clone from a company that was called PCs Limited. And PCs Limited was actually a DBA for a company called Dell Computers. So I bought one of the first Dell computers, which was through PCs Limited, and carted it home. And I had this computer and this amber monitor, no color, just amber. That was it. And a stack of manuals, like this, huge stack of manuals, one for each computer program and one for the computer itself and one for the monitor and all this stuff that I had to read through and learn. And I started kind of banging away on the computer. And then it's like, okay, Marsha, now what I want to do next is I want to log in via long distance to this system that's out in California, and it's going to be about $10 an hour. And this led to a rather tense discussion.
I can imagine.
And of course, acknowledging who wears the pants in the family, that we squashed that idea. She wasn't up for it. Yeah. So no, I wasn't going to do that. So what was I going to do? The next thing I could do is look for local bulletin board systems so that I could figure out how that whole thing works.
Oh, yes.
And the first one I discovered was called Secret Masters of Fandom.
Oh.
Abbreviated as SMOF, S-M-O-F, BBS.
I wanted to know what the hell that was when you sent it over. I was like, what is a SMOF?
SMOF BBS. It was operated by a guy named Earl Cooley, whose handle was Shiva. And it was for science fiction fans specifically and science fiction writers.
Oh, wow.
And one of the first people I met on that BBS used the handle Jules Verne.
Oh.
And I later discovered that Jules Verne was Bruce Sterling.
Oh, no kidding.
So that was the start of my long, friendship with Bruce. And another guy on there went by the handle Johnny Mnemonic, which was from a short story by a guy named William Gibson, who wrote Neuromancer, which figures in a big way into all this. Johnny Mnemonic was Mike Godwin, who became the first attorney for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So, I was kind of meeting these guys, and I'm not really much of a gamer, but I learned that there was something called Steve Jackson Games, and this guy, Steve Jackson, created what they called generic universal role-playing systems, or GURPS, they called it. What that really was like, Dungeons and Dragons, is a role-playing game.
Mm-hmm.
You just get a book of rules basically, and
Yep.
and character descriptions and stuff like that, and you just kind of figure it out from there, and you start playing the game, and it's sort of like being in a world,
Right.
know. Well, the GURPS were like that too. It was like they were role-playing games.
Okay.
And Steve did other kinds of games too, but for these role-playing games, he used his bulletin board system as a playtest site. People would log in there and get some of the game stuff, and they would actually kind of play the games online and offline, but basically they were testing games for him. That was part of what was happening there.
Okay.
The name of his bulletin board system was Illuminati.
Oh.
Fairly
Nice.
obvious, right?
Nice.
Robert Anton Wilson riff, really. And he had a game called Illuminati too. But
are you talking about the books?
yeah,
Yeah.
Robert Anton Wilson had written this
Yes.
Illuminatus trilogy.
So
And
it's so good. It's so good.
yeah, exactly. And it was like a religious influence on a lot of people at the time, you know. I mean, people were really they were getting, it was all kind of ironic, funny, crazy stuff.
Yeah.
That kind of made fun of the cult behavior of human beings and the power exchanges of human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So Steve had this BBS, and he had people on every BBS had email. Some of it was local, but more and more, I mentioned before that you could swap email using something called UUCP. You could send email over the internet so that it would go to other bulletin board systems.
Right.
So email was starting to evolve as something people definitely used and used very effectively. So am I getting ahead of myself? So I have joined the Well. And one of the things that happened when I joined the Well, I should say that just before I joined the Well, I actually met Bruce Sterling at a Writers League meeting where he was giving a talk. And that's when I found out that he was Jules Verne on the BBS. And in that talk, he talked about this publication called Fact Sheet 5. Fact Sheet 5 was a zine about zines. It was a zine that was published by a guy named Mike Gunderloy. And Mike basically reviewed every zine he could get his hands on. Like, he read tons of zines and wrote reviews of them. I don't know how he found time to do it all, really. And Fact Sheet 5 started as kind of like this mimeograph thing, and then it turned into an actual zine, an actual magazine, more of a magazine format. But I learned about that from Bruce. And then when I joined the Well, I discovered that Mike Gunderloy had an account on the Well, and he had a conference of his own there, a Fact Sheet 5 conference where people talked about zines. And I became active in that conference and met a guy named Mark Frauenfelder. Mark was publishing a zine at the time with his wife, Carla Sinclair, and it was called Boing Boing. So this zine, Boing Boing, was, to the extent it had circulation, it was pretty popular, and everybody thought it was like this super cool zine. And I got excited about it. I had not actually seen a physical copy of it when I met Mark, but Mark invited me to become an editor on Boing Boing.
Cool.
And what he wanted me to do was be the fiction editor, because I had a background in, you know, I'd like English major and that sort of thing. And I did that. I agreed to that. He sent me these tons of submissions that he had of fiction, in hard copy, by the way. And it was like a slush pile. And I got this slush pile, and the stuff was so bad that I told Mark that he should quit soliciting fiction and you know, run fiction only occasionally and accept fiction only from known sources.
Right.
Because it was just, well, for one thing, Boing Boing was really not known for its fiction anyway. So I had to take on another role at Boing Boing, and the role that I got, what we settled on calling me, was Cyborganic Jive Meister, because I kind of like had a habit of putting things together and introducing people to each other and so forth. So I became the Jive Meister.
Jive Meister. I like it.
And one of the people that I met, who was another associate editor at Boing Boing, was a guy named Paco Zander Nathan. Paco lived in Austin, and I lived in Austin, and Paco was also on the well. So we started communicating with each other, and then we met, and we started hanging out. And Paco and I we both read Mondo 2000, and we were both focused on the zine world. So just to say a little bit about the zine world too, what had happened there, this was sort of like a transition from the mass media, mass magazine world to internet culture. A step along the way was the creation of desktop publishing capabilities so that people without a whole lot of money could still get the means to produce a magazine or a zine. So all kinds of people were suddenly starting to create and publish and get printed and get circulated small scale publications, zines. And there were some places like Tower Records, for instance, was known for having a huge number of the zines that were available in all of its stores. So they were starting to circulate more and better. And when I met Paco, we started talking about the idea of, so he knew people and I had known people who had things that they would like to be able to bring to market, but they couldn't afford the cost of bringing it to market. For instance, if you developed a software package in order to actually get it into the stores, because software was sold on discs in stores, you'd go to Egghead Software or whatever and buy a box that had the software and the manual in it, which nobody does anymore. But back then, that was how you had to do it, because the internet was not fast. You didn't have broadband, and you couldn't like download programs at that point. So there was a big cost of getting things into the stores. And what occurred to us was you could potentially sell things over the internet. You could just kind of let people know you had this thing over the internet, and they could order it over the internet, and you could send it to them over the internet. Radical idea at the time, it turns out. But we started thinking about that, and our first step, we decided, should be to cultivate a set of people who would be suppliers of things that we could sell. So he knew people, I knew people, we contacted people, we got the word out, and we started an email list. The email list was really supposed to serve the purpose of pulling people together to build out this kind of online business that we had in mind. But it actually turned into a cultural thing. The Fringeware email list brought a bunch of fringy people together. And Fringeware was a name that I came up with when we were talking sometime, when we were talking about, kind of like our fringy software kind of stuff. Oh, Fringeware. So the list we created became a place where people were talking about all kinds of cool stuff, not just the stuff that we originally created the list for. So we had kind of a cultural phenomenon brewing there. And what we decided to do at that point was, so one of the steps that we had to take was to be able to accept credit cards. So I went to the bank and talked to the bankers about, partly about maybe getting some financing, which they would be happy to do if I would sign my house over. we found another source of money than that. And the other thing was we wanted to be able to accept credit cards. And they said, well, where's your store? Well, we don't have a store. We don't have a storefront. We're going to sell products online. I said, no, you can't do that.
They didn't figure out.
You can't just have people sending a credit card number online in plain text. So they said, that's nobody does that. You're not going to be able to do it. We said, well, we could secure the transaction. Well, like with cryptography. No, nobody does that. So we were shut down. And in order to be able to accept credit cards, we needed a store. So we found a place in Austin called New Bohemia, which I think still exists.
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
And it was basically a sublease operation. A person had a store, a big store, and she leased parts of the store to various smaller operators. And we became one of those. So we got a piece of this store where we set up our Fringeware store, and we created a big mural on the side that was kind of amazing. Monty McCarter, who was had become our art director, put that together. But the other thing that we had done was that we decided, okay, we can't sell online. We need to have a catalog. So we started to create a catalog, and they said, well, why don't we make a zine? Let's have a magazine, and we can just put the catalog in back. I used to read a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland that was like that. It was this great, it was about movies or horror movies and science fiction movies. And in the back of it, they had this section that was the catalog. So we created Fringeware Review.
Certainly, because you had a comic book, they were always going to be selling something in the back of the comic book.
In the back of the comic book.
Right on.
Sea monkeys, man, I bought so many sea monkeys.
Sea monkey, that's good eating.
So sea monkeys were the best. With their little crowns and their little acrobatic stuff they could do.
So, can you see this?
No.
Like
Paco. So let me say, Paco was a genius.
Okay.
And he was really the soul of this operation. Like, he did all the product acquisition, shipping, everything. He did pretty much everything. And he also learned everything about desktop publishing. He actually learned he built the email software that we used for our listserv. He built that listserv. He learned about the standards for email transmission, and he set that up. And then can you see this order form? He made an order form that looks exactly like an IRS.
It does look like that, like
tax form. Yeah.
Like a 1040 or easy or whatever.
And then we had this, just this catalog in the back. Mark Fraunfelder referred to this as a magalog.
Magalog.
It was a little like Coevolution Quarterly, a little bit like Boing Boing. And, through our list, we had met a ton of people who were eager to write for us. And we didn't pay a whole lot of money, but we paid something, which was unusual at the time, for somebody to actually get paid for writing stuff, for zines anyway. Right. And this cover here was done by a guy named Bill Barker, who had this great schwa concept, schwa aliens.
Yeah,
that was kind of a big deal back then. So we started this magazine, Fringeware Review, and put the catalog in it. Started getting mail orders. There was a distributor in Austin who got us international distribution. It was called Fine Print.
Cool.
And they loved to bring zines in and distribute them widely, though they didn't always get money back to us the way they should, but that's another story. And all of this stuff was going on. We got connected with Mondo 2000. Those people were on the well, so we became friends with them, and we Paco and I both were writing for Mondo 2000 as well, and writing for various other publications. So we were doing writing We were running our little business. We were getting stuff shipped, making a little money. Paco, took all the money because he was doing all the real work of making the business happen. And I was more focused on doing the cultural stuff. I had a job, in addition to what we were doing, an actual day job. So I was covered. So the other thing that happens in the midst of all this is also on the well. So much was happening on the well. On the well, a guy named John Perry Barlow met a guy named Mitch Kapoor, who was the guy who was his business was Lotus 123. And Mitch and John, well, I should tell you the Barlow story. So Barlow had pulled together a kind of panel on the well. This was done on the well. People just logging in and posting on the well, having a conversation about like new computer technology and personal computers, the advent of the computer, and the kind of revolution we were having, and especially about like hackers and what hackers do. And a couple of the guys who were in this panel were hackers. Let's see, fiber optic. I can't remember the name of the other one, but there were a couple of hackers in there. And in the course of this discussion, I can't remember exactly what happened. There was something that happened between Barlow and fiber optic that got fiber optic irritated or activated in some way. And he went off and downloaded a bunch of like personal credit card stuff, I think it was, he hacked in and got a bunch of data about Barlow and put it into the conference, into the discussion that they were having. It got deleted pretty quickly, but he kind of made the point with Barlow that about these insecure systems and how I can get your information any day of the week. And Barlow got to thinking about that, and one of the things he was realizing was that these guys were way ahead of law enforcement. They were way ahead of policy developers. The technology was outrunning policy. It was outrunning enforcement. And that somebody like fiber optic, who is really just a kid and is not, malicious really, who's kind of like hacking into things for sport, could get himself into a whole lot of trouble, especially given that the people who make the policies and the people who enforce the laws don't really understand the technology at all. And something that is relatively benign could be seen as less benign and maybe as a terrible crime.
Yeah.
And that sort of led to the conversations. The real conversation there was that we don't really have the policies, we don't really have the understanding within law enforcement to deal with this electronic frontier that we're beginning to have. It's like the frontier in that the laws are not established for it yet. We really don't know. It can be kind of a free for all. And as those laws develop, there could be very bad laws that would be made by people who don't know anything about the technology. So they started the Electronic Frontier Foundation with the intention of having an input into policy and educating law enforcement about technology and, kind of creating an informed path forward in the development of policy and technology. I stumbled into this because, I found this place where this was being discussed on the well. And another thing that happened was that when I was logged into SMOF BBS one night, Steve Jackson showed up. He usually didn't come to SMOF because he had his own bulletin board, right? Well, he showed up one night and he said, Secret Service just busted into our place and took all of our computers, and we don't know why. We have no idea what's going on here.
Whoa.
It's like, what the fuck?
Wow.
So, and he said that on there, and, you know, Bruce Sterling is there, Mike Godwin is there, and Mike Godwin has just been hired by the Electronic Frontier Foundation to be their first, like, counsel, their first attorney. So Godwin hears this about Steve Jackson, and Bruce hears it, and they get all this information together and they send it off to the EFF. EFF takes the Steve Jackson case as a really good example of what they're talking about. It's like somebody has busted into this guy's business and carried off his computers. And why did they do it? Well, here was the precipitating thing. There was a DA named Bill Cook in Chicago, of all places, who's working with the Secret Service, and they're like worried about these hackers and people breaking into computer networks. And there is a group of hackers who carry the subtle name Legion of Doom.
Oh, yeah.
And the guys in the Legion of Doom would go out and do stuff, you know, and they would hack into places and kind of like show something to show that they were really able to get into the system. One of those guys hacked into the Bell South system and found a document that was about the 9/11 system within Bell South, grabbed the document, took it back. Legion of Doom had a newsletter that they sent around called FRAC, PHRACK. And in this newsletter, they included this 9/11 document, and it was being shipped around to all the members of the Legion of Doom, right? One of the members of the Legion of Doom worked at Steve Jackson Games, and they're following these transmissions. So they see that one of the recipients of the newsletter is there. So they're going to Steve Jackson Games because this is a den of hackers, right? Of course, Steve Jackson has no idea any of this stuff's going on until, you know, the Secret Service show up, and the guy that they were after, they went to his house, and he heard them talking about how they had a battering ram and were going to knock the door down at Steve Jackson Games, and talked him out of it. He said, "No, don't do that. I've got a key. I'll let you in." So he lets them in. They take all the computers. They find one of the GURPS books that's being developed. It's called GURPS Cyberpunk. And they look through this and they say, wow, there's a manual here for computer crime. It's just a role-playing game. Manual for computer crime. So they carted all this stuff off, and in doing so, they broke the law. The Secret Service broke the law, the Electronic Computer Privacy Act. And I don't know exactly the specifics of the illegal piece, but it was, I think it had to do with the fact that private email was stored on those computers, and they just carted them off, and they weren't really supposed to do that. Plus, they really didn't have any reason to raid Steve Jackson Games.
Well, did they have they didn't have a warrant?
Yeah, that never seemed to stop them back in those days. It was pretty much the Wild West when it came to law enforcement.
They may have had a warrant, I'm not sure, but whatever the case, they were in the wrong.
Well, clearly you can't.
So
that's Fourth Amendment violation.
And Steve Jackson sued the Secret Service.
Excellent.
Kind of unprecedented. He
awesome.
sued the Secret Service and won. And his case was supported by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It was their first big case. I recall seeing this big picture of Steve in Scientific American. You know, everybody's making a big deal about. Everybody kind of knew about the Steve Jackson case back then. Bruce Sterling actually wrote a book that focused quite a bit on the Steve Jackson case and some of the other shaking down of hackers. It was called The Hacker Crackdown, which also became one of the very first books to be distributed for free over the internet at some point. Yeah, and it's still available for free over the internet at Project Gutenberg. So after all of this stuff happened, EFF had been planning to build itself out as a kind of community-based organization. And Steve, was in a lot of conversations with the EFF guys. So he said at some point, he said, you should try an alpha chapter, a first chapter for your chapters organization. You should try it in Austin. Austin, it's really kind of a hotbed of networking. There's a lot of people there that would be interested, and we'd really be able to build something there. And they said, okay, we'll do that. And they had hired Cliff Figallo, who was from the Well. He was one of the directors of the Well, had been managing the Wells community. So EFF hired him to help build the EFF community. And Steve came back to Austin and invited just a kind of blanket invitation over BBSs and, all the usual ways to connect with the people in this sort of networked community in Austin. And this was also posted on the Well about how he was going to have this big picnic at his house to talk about something really important. And Shiva and I from Smough BBS, he and I had become friends by then, and we decided to go together. And we picked up this like 6 foot long sandwich, I think, from Thundercloud Subs or somewhere.
Wow.
And took it as our contribution to the picnic. So we went out to the picnic. There's picnic tables out there. It's at Steve Jackson Games, and he's got picnic tables outside, and there's a bunch of people there. And Steve gets up on the picnic table, and he makes a rah-rah speech and says, we're going to have the first chapter of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And he asked for volunteers for the board. And I volunteered, and I became one of the members of the board for EFF Austin.
That's awesome.
And then we started having like meetings. We met every week for a year before we finally had a public meeting and invited a bunch of people. And EFF Austin, 30 years later, still exists, and I'm still on the board and was president for a long time. But that was all kind of a very interesting thing, the EFF Austin thing coming together, and Fringeware and EFF Austin started having some connections through my participation. And I had also connected with another group in town that I found out about in a Newsweek article. In Newsweek, there was this thing about this robot group in Austin, a bunch of guys who like to build robots. They were like engineer types, and I tracked down the robot group. It turned out the robot group had an annual event called RoboFest. So we connected Fringeware and EFF Austin, got connected to RoboFest. And I forget which year it was, 94 or 95, RoboFest included a Fringeware presence and EFF Austin presence. And what happened for EFF Austin, one of the things that EFF Austin did was we had a guy showed up at a meeting of the board. He was a systems administrator named Doug Barnes. Doug, he later went to law school, and he's an attorney now. He's like a tech attorney in New York, very successful. I think he retired recently. But Doug at the time was a systems administrator, and he said, what we really should do is set up a local area network, a LAN, with a bunch of computers on it at RoboFest and connect that to the internet so that we can show people what they can do with the internet. And one of the things we'll do is we'll include a MOO, which is like an online like a text-based virtual reality that you reach through the network. It's a place where everything is described in text, but it's like going into a world. It's a great gaming environment, among other things.
Those, and that was one of the early Moo adventures.
Mhm.
Yeah, and the name of the Moo was going to be taken from a book. Doug Barnes had a friend named Neil Stevenson who had written a book called Snow Crash that included a thing called the metaverse.
Oh, I read that.
So the Moo was called the Metaverse Moo. And Steve was so excited about this Moo and how well it worked out at RoboFest that he said, there's a business in this. I'm going to make this Moo into a commercial thing. So in doing that, he needed a way for people to reach the Moo. And he said, well, what we'll do is we'll set ourselves up as an internet services provider. There were not very many commercial internet services providers at that time. It was kind of a new thing that was starting to crop up as a business. And there was one here in Austin called Realtime that almost everybody was using. And then Steve decided he was going to start a new internet services provider as a location for the Moo and call it Illuminati Online. And it would be io.com, just io.com. And io.com became really popular. People from all over the country were signing up for it. Just if it was kind of considered cool. I mean, everybody thought Steve Jackson was pretty cool. Steve Jackson's Games was pretty cool. And being on io.com was pretty cool. And it became kind of a big thing. And, Fringeware had been on Realtime, and then we moved to io.com for a while before we eventually we got fringeware.com and had our own thing. So that became a big deal and ran for quite a while. io.com is gone now. It eventually went away. And the Moo didn't last a really long time. It turned out that most of the focus was on the ISP and less so on the Moo. But that was a manifestation of the very powerful community that had formed in Austin around the internet. And, we had people we'd have things down at Europa Books on the Drag, which no longer exists. But at the time, it was a place where we had a lot of events for EFF Austin, and Fringeware had a kind of a table set up there where they were selling our products. It was just a weird time. It was a transitional time, and people were finding their way to the internet. And also another thing that happened on the Well, another conference that got set up was a private conference for some people. And I got into this thing where some people were starting a new magazine that was going to be called Wired. And they had this private conference where they were discussing it on the Well. And the Wired issue, the first issue of Wired came out in 1992, I think January. And around the time it came out, or right at the time it came out, the Electronic Frontier Foundation had invited representatives from a bunch of local groups that had formed that were EFF-like groups to come to Georgia Tech. So to fly to Georgia and attend a meeting to talk about building out the Electronic Frontier Foundation community. So you had like people from Alabama and Georgia and New York and just various places around the country where groups had formed. There was one, I think the one in New York was called NTE, which stood for Not the EFF. But they were all kind of interested in becoming chapters of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So you had a bunch of people who showed up And we had a meeting set. We come into the meeting. The board of directors of EFF Austin have been at a retreat prior to the meeting. They come to the meeting, walk in the door, and announce that they're not going to be a chapters organization after all. They have a new incoming director or co-director with Cliff, Jerry Berman, who had worked with the ACLU and who had been very focused on Washington lobbying efforts. And he had convinced the EFF that they really needed to go to Washington and that they needed to become an organization that tried to get policy set through the legislatures. And EFF agreed, went for that. So they showed up at this meeting at Georgia Tech, and we all were kind of disappointed to hear that. But there was a very interesting conversation that followed. They said, now let's talk about what we can do. And the idea that this is what Jerry Berman did a lot of the talking, and he said, it really wouldn't be right for us we're like a vanguard of creating policy for the internet as a decentralized system, and for us to build a highly centralized organization with a bunch of chapters just wouldn't make sense. Now, backstory on that is I think that Jerry was concerned because prior to this meeting, there had been an email list set up for all these different groups, and people were fighting tooth and nail. There was a bunch of shit flying around, and he knew that he wouldn't be able to control these other organizations and their messaging, and he was concerned about that because the approach that he takes requires you to have more control. So that's one of the things I think that fed in. I mean, I don't know this for sure, but I think that probably fed into the decision to not do the community thing. Anyway, but what he said is what we can do is we can build, all of your organizations can be part of a network that we build where we will be on the network as peers, and EFF will not be in any kind of superior position, and you won't be a part of EFF, but we'll network together and do the activism that we need to do as a decentralized network of organizations. And I personally thought that was great. I thought, oh, wow, that's a good idea. That's probably the right way to do it. Some other people were disappointed. I think some people were really hoping to, among other things, get money from EFF for their organizations, which could have been a good thing too. But that's kind of what happened. So EFF went through a lot after that. There's a lot of changes at EFF over the years before it became what it is now. It's like kind of a law firm. It's kind of like the ACLU, but focused on computer networks pretty strictly. We worked some with the ACLU back then too. Anyway, so I have talked and talked and talked. And I really wanted to tell this story. I wanted to try to go over all of these things that happened. There's a lot more that I haven't mentioned because I just couldn't possibly remember it all or get to it. But this, I think, was a very interesting time to be jamming along and to step into the internet kind of unsuspecting what it was going to become.
Yeah, it was interesting for anyone that happened to get into computing, and I got into it early on. 1983, I got a little tiny computer that had like 16K of memory, and played with that, and it kind of went from there. It got more and more expensive too. So, the description of some of the things you were talking about, like the well was kind of hijacked, the concept was hijacked by outfits like AOL and CompuServe and Genie, which were the big commercial online services that didn't they were on the internet, but they didn't let you on the internet. They were just
Yeah.
as a way of getting a bunch of people in there that was in their enclosed garden, I guess you would call it. And I belonged to all of those. And
yeah, me too.
there were a lot of good people on there, but as soon as the internet became available to ISPs in the Bay Area, I was gone.
Everything was an experiment back then. That's the thing. People were trying all kinds of stuff, and the mainstreaming had the effect that mainstreaming has, and eventually money comes into it, and
Yep.
money has an effect.
Well, what we experienced in the Bay Area, and maybe you did here in Austin, the ISPs, the independent ISPs, started to disappear because they were being merged with outfits like AOL and CompuServe, who said, "Okay, we need that, for their own purposes," and that's what happened to my original ISP, CCNet, in the area. It suddenly went away, and it was owned by AOL.
I don't recall really seeing that here so much. And the thing is that at some point we moved to broadband, and eventually you just have these major internet service providers, and I guess there's a very small number of providers now that provide the backbone for the internet. It feels like it's a lot less decentralized than it was. Part of that's because the way people interact with the internet is by going to something like Facebook, or I guess I can't say Twitter. It's X now.
No, it's Zitter.
X.
It's Zitter.
Shitter. That's pronounced shitter, I think.
Or shitter. I was going with shitter. A lot of people are going with Zitter, but whatever it is, it's not Twitter anymore.
Yeah, well, that guy made lots of friends yesterday with his little where he told the head of Disney to fuck off. And it's like, okay.
And it was like he paused, like everybody's going to laugh or something. And everybody just like stared at him. Like, are you insane? Well, he's insane.
I'm going to run out by the truck, though. Running
He's crazy.
It's a real different. I mean, I didn't really. It didn't even occur to me envision that we would be where we are now. I do remember early on there were people on the internet who really did not want to see mainstreaming at all, and they didn't want to see it expand at all. And it's like, this is our thing. We don't want to have a bunch of normies coming in.
Normies.
But that's what we've got,
folks. And I just kind of went, well, whatever, and continued doing what I was doing, because there's always people who they want to be unique and different, but they didn't want anyone else getting involved and being unique and different as well.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the internet was initially when it first became popular to be on it. It was a badge of courage. I'm on the internet. I'm not on AOL, and and eventually, who cares?
I used to think that it was crazy to assume that anybody would ever watch television over the internet, because you look at See You See Me, and it would be this little tiny screen within your screen, and the whole idea that we would have this high definition digital transmission going on, and streaming services where you can stream in 4K. It's just crazy. But here in Austin, we had people who were developing that technology, and it was in the mid 2000s. I was part of a thing called the Digital Convergence Initiative, where we had meetings where people showed up and were in the process of developing that stuff. And we were talking, it was kind of economic, we were focused on economic development for the area. And when people talked about having high definition streaming, I just couldn't even conceive of it. And then we had this big party during South by Southwest where the major thing that we were going to include was streaming a band that was playing in San Antonio on a big screen at this party via HD. And the thing almost failed because there was like some bad link or bad connection. But,
Oh God.
but they pulled it off, and it was incredible,
That's
to
great.
see. And now it's common.
Yeah, I got involved with streaming radio. Online radio was a little thing back when I got started, and that was like in the mid to late '90s, and it was impossible to really get anything that was entertaining. You use something like Real Networks to kind of stream music.
Ooh, I remember that.
It was ugly, but then all of a sudden, people started developing apps that are programs that could really do it as long as you had a good bit of bandwidth. I think the least you could have was like a 32K connection. You could do it on dial-up, but it was kind of stupid. But it's gotten a lot better since then. I'm still doing it. I've had two internet radio stations, for 20 some odd years.
Yeah, I miss Radio Free Plutopia.
Yeah. We may have to, revive that. It just depends on how things go in the home life here right now.
Well, we have actually run out of time, and I guess the last thing I'll say is that if they can figure out how to stream 4K programming 24/7 from all sorts of different sources, maybe they can figure out how to deal with climate change.
No.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Where's the fun in that? It's not a marketable product.
Well, I guess we are done. Thanks so much for listening to me.
Bye, guys. Thank you. It was a good story. This is story time.
Right on.
We'll do it again.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.